All right. Well, I guess we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Caroline Hutchins. I'm with the Cumberland River Compact. I'm here with my colleague, Gray Perry. And we are excited to talk to you guys today about repairing minor stream banks that have erosion issues. We hope you're tuning in. If you're a homeowner who has a creek that's eroding, we're here to give you some solutions. And you know what? I just realized I don't have the clicker thing. So, sorry guys, one important detail here. Thanks, Gray. All right. But first, before we get started, just want to tell you a little bit about the Cumberland River Compact, in case you aren't familiar with our organization. Our vision is clean and abundant water within the Cumberland River Basin. About 3 million people live in the Cumberland River Basin, and we want to create a healthy waterway ecosystem where everyone can thrive, plants, animals, and humans. So we do a lot of education work, like what we're doing right now. We work in schools. We do a lot of restoration work as well, actually getting into streams, doing repair work. We have an urban waters program. So urban waters is, we do rain gardens, rain barrel work, anything kind of working in urban systems, and then working lands. That's actually my department. I work with a lot of farmers, and we also work on abandoned mine lands. Just kind of illustrate some of the work we do, pulling up invasive plants here, working with children. We do a lot of STEM work. Depave programs, that's removing impermeable surfaces so that water can penetrate. And then this is a creek cleanup. We also do river cleanups. If you're interested in getting involved with the compact or learning more, you can go to our website, cumberlandrivercompact.org. But moving forward, today we are going to talk about stream bank repair. First, we're going to talk about Hendersonville's watershed, problems that are caused by eroding stream banks, why it's an issue, the benefits of riparian buffers, how to evaluate the health of your stream in your backyard, and then options if you are seeing some erosion issues, solutions that you can implement as a resident. And we'll save the very end for Q&A. There we go. Okay, so first talk a little bit about our watershed. This is the Cumberland River Basin. In Hendersonville, you are in Old Hickory Lake. The sun there is Hendersonville. This is one of the most urban watersheds in the Cumberland River Basin. It is 985 square miles with 1,300 miles of streams and rivers, including 93 miles that are actually on the Cumberland River. It's one of 14 sub-watersheds in the basin. And what that means is that all the precipitation in this watershed drains into Old Hickory Lake, Old Hickory Dam. So let's talk about the top 10 causes of stream impairment. Pathogens are the #1 issue causing stream impairment. So this might be animals whose feces get into waterways in urban areas. It tends to do with sewer overflow and runoff. Siltation is the next top polluter, and we're going to get into that on a different slide. Nutrients. So nutrients might sound like a good thing, like don't we want nutrients? Not when we have too many nutrients flowing into our waterways. So this happens when maybe you fertilize your lawn or a farm fertilizes their fields, and that attaches to soil particles or just runs off into our waterways. When there's too many nutrients, there's too much algae, it lowers oxygen levels, kills the critters. It's kind of a cascading effect. Altered streamside vegetation, that's just when riparian buffers are removed, and we're going to get into the importance of riparian buffers. And then these are some more minor causes of impairment. All right, so going back to that problem #2 that causes stream impairment, that's siltation and erosion. So siltation, that just means tiny soil particles. So the problem with erosion is that it disrupts aquatic life by, there's a few different ways. It gets into the tiny crevices of rocks in our stream beds, and the smallest aquatic creatures that live in these little holes can't survive if they're essentially made homeless because their home is full of dirt. It's sort of like the Dust Bowl, but for aquatic life. And when they die, it goes up the food chain, and it's this, again, a cascading effect. Siltation interferes with photosynthesis. If you have a river that looks like this picture in the top right-hand corner, photosynthesis isn't happening there because sunlight just isn't infiltrating. Decreases dissolved oxygen. I'm sure you understand the importance of oxygen for all life. It increases water treatment costs. In Tennessee, we're reliant on surface water for all of our drinking water. So, you can't drink what looks like the picture in the top right-hand corner. That has to be cleaned. And then sediment also increases the presence of pollutants and pathogens when that soil runs off from, farms or homes where there's been chemicals sprayed. It attaches to the soil particles and winds up in the waterways. So what causes siltation? Land disturbing activities. So if a farm tills up a big field and then we get a heavy rain and that washes into waterways. Construction. I'm sure in Hendersonville you've seen a lot of new building happening, and you know what it looks like when there's a construction site and the land has just been cleared and there's loose soil. Again, rain happens and it runs off into waterways. In-stream bank erosion happens if there isn't a strong riparian zone, if there aren't plants and their roots holding the stream side in place. Runoff from impermeable surfaces, so this is, like a parking lot. Of course, water can't get through a parking lot, so it just runs off into our sewers, into our waterways. And of course, heavier rainfall is exacerbating all of this. I'm sure we've gotten so much rain this summer, and we're all aware of these heavier rainfall incidents happening. So why does this matter? Well, in addition to all the reasons I just named, it increases water treatment costs. It hurts the life chain up and down. It can look unsightly. We have lots of endangered species, and these are some endangered species that are in the Old Hickory watershed. These first three pictures are of mussels, and you might know that mussels are an indicator species, meaning that they can kind of tell you if a waterway is healthy. They also serve an important ecosystem function in that they filter streams. They make it healthier for everything else to live there. And then this last picture of the little flowers is the Spring Creek bladder pod. And this is a tiny little plant that is actually only found in Wilson and Rutherford counties. So it's a special little plant, and it is endangered. And we're so glad that you guys are tuning in to learn more about how to take care of these plants, as well as reduce erosion issues. So here's a couple pictures of some pretty serious erosion, and this is why we're talking to you today, because we don't want your creek to look like this. It's unsightly, you're losing land, it's dangerous if you have pets or children around it. So we're gonna kind of help you deal with that. And what we propose is that you install a riparian buffer. A riparian buffer is just essentially plants beside your waterways. The big plants, small plants, plants with roots that really get into the ground, that hold that soil in place. They reduce erosion so that your acreage isn't maintained. They're beautiful. Those pictures we just saw before, that's not very beautiful. And you can see this picture here in the middle of a beautiful stream, and here on the end, that's kind of what we're looking for. It's nice and shady, lots of healthy plant life. Riparian buffers can reduce noise. They capture any sort of runoff, so we have less polluted waterways. They're easy to maintain. You don't have to mow them or mulch them or spray them. And of course, they're friendly to aquatic species, kind of going back into the less polluted waterways. And of course, it attracts wildlife habitat, all sorts of pollinator species, just generally a wonderful thing for the environment. And now I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Gray Perry. create a microphone here.
All right. Testing, is that working all right? Great. All right, so again, my name's Gray. I've been with the Compact for the past 6 years, and hopefully I can give you a good overview of just some approachable options for homeowners to address stream bank erosion. We're not going to be going super in depth on all the different techniques that you can do, but it'll tell you what you're allowed to do, what's cheap and approachable, and then when you kind of need to call in a professional to help you repair something that might be threatening infrastructure or being very too much for a homeowner to address by themselves. So the first part of this is just kind of understanding the scope of the issue and what you're looking for. Is your stream healthy? Is it not healthy? Typically in urban watersheds like Hendersonville, a lot of our streams have what's called the urban stream syndrome. They've been channelized, which you'd think helps remove water off-site faster, which it does, but there's a lot of issues that come along with that, which the predominant one is stream bank erosion. You are not slowing down that water, you're increasing the speed and velocity in which it's moving through these systems, which causes a lot of scouring of banks. Urban streams are often very incised, meaning they've eroded downward, and so they're not connected to their floodplains anymore, which is also a huge issue. Streams naturally flood. It's a good thing for them to do because it can provide some kind of storage capacity for those areas to hold water before it gets moved downstream. Obviously, we don't want this to impact people's infrastructure, but where they can flood and they're not going to impact people's homes and property, that's a good thing because effectively, that's protecting everybody else downstream. So if you look at this picture on the right, I don't know my left from my right, the gently sloped banks picture right here, this is a stream that's very well connected to its floodplain. It's got a decent riparian wooded area behind it, which means when it floods, it's not only going to be able to reach that floodplain and spill over the waterways, but it also has a lot of that riparian vegetation, which is going to increase the infiltration capacity of those stream banks there. Trees evapotranspirate a ton of water. They help lower that water table just enough to give you a little bit of flood storage here that will also help kind of slow down that water and allow it to infiltrate from the stream during flood events and also overland flow that's coming off of your roof or other areas too as well. A stream like this could probably use the riparian area on this other side where it's predominantly grass, because as we saw in those other pictures, grass like Kentucky bluegrass, which I hate to tell you is not from Kentucky, it's from Europe. They're invasive. They have a root system that's maybe 4 inches deep in good soil, and they do not do a good job of holding soil in place. So if this stream that looks fairly decent beyond just the fescue and everything beyond it, if it is allowed to stay like that and is not revegetated, eventually it was going to turn to this other picture we see under the stable vertical banks. That stream there's nothing holding that soil in place. As that stream tries to meander, if you live in a very highly developed area with a lot of impervious area, it's going to be introducing more stormwater during storm events. And so as that stream is trying to transport that water downstream, you're going to see what's called sloughing and erosion along those banks. And so typically when you start seeing erosion of higher than a foot, your stream is really starting to destabilize, that's when you need to act, because they can turn into huge problems that are harder and more expensive to fix later on down the line. So kind of understanding what a healthy stream looks like versus not a healthy stream, you also need to understand what you can do and what you're dealing with. We certainly don't want you to come into a situation and try to replant a riparian zone and say this is fixed when it needs an engineer to come in and address some serious issues. So typically, you can do some small-scale stream bank stabilization techniques like live staking and establishing a riparian zone along these smaller streams that have less than 3 feet of erosion. Streams like this typically don't have as high of a discharge, so there's not going to be as much erosive forces on them, and that can allow you to live stake and get some roots in the ground that are going to hold that soil in place. So this picture here, eligible for repair, this is probably something that either you could come in and live stake, you can plant some bare root seedlings, maybe some 1-inch caliper trees and extend that riparian buffer. It's not too wide. This actually might be on the verge of getting too large to work on. I typically kind of use a rule of thumb. If it's wider than 6 feet, you might be starting to get into territory you need to consult somebody to work on. You could even, speaking of consultants, you could hire someone to come in for very cheaply with just some basic permitting to regrade those banks at a 3-to-1 slope, get some native plants in, and basically just connect that stream back to its floodplain and establish that riparian area. This picture on the under this restoration needed side, this is something that we can see is impacting infrastructure. So if you have a stream that's eroding and it's going to impact your infrastructure, you're probably going to need to consult with an engineer to make sure that what you get in place is going to be enough to save that infrastructure, whether it's a road or a building or any other type of infrastructure that you may have. These banks are way higher than 3 feet, and I've definitely seen ones that are up to 15 feet tall. They'll start sloughing. It's hard to, basically the banks will collapse, and it's hard to get vegetation established in time, and that stream is not connected to its floodplain at all. So that water is going to be transported quickly. It's going to be scouring those bank edges, and it's going to be something that you're going to have to hire an engineer to come in, establish some kind of stone toe to protect the toe of the bank right there, and then also connect that stream to its floodplain during high flooding events. And you can still establish a riparian area here. Typically, what I tell people, if they have a very severe problem, they can't afford an engineer to come in and work with it, I recommend that they very first should do that. But the kind of latch ditch effort is, if you don't have any trees and you don't have any roots holding that soil in place, go ahead and establish that no-mow zone, get some heavy trees in place far enough away to the bank that can go ahead and start sinking those deep, deep roots. So what can you do? You kind of understand, what may be too large to work on. If you have erosion that's greater than 3 feet, that might be where you need to call in somebody to draw up some engineering plans for that. But if you have more minor erosion, there are just a few different things that you can do, and I'm going to walk you through it into the kind of what I would call the laziest approach, where you really don't have to put in that much time and resources into do it, versus the little more intensive and maybe a little more expensive approach, but in terms of allowing that stream to continue to erode, it's going to be much cheaper in the long run. So the first thing is to slow your mow. Do not mow to the edge of your creek. Don't spray at the edge of your creek. Basically, if you have a picture that looks like this stream right here, where it is just grass right to the edge, you are guaranteed to have stream bank erosion. There is nothing holding that soil in place. If you live in a really urban area, those erosive flows are going to cause that stream to start to scour downward. It's going to incise. And then as it incises and you have more flow coming into it, it is going to try to widen and connect back to that floodplain too as well over time. That's where we're going to have all that sediment transported downstream. It's going to get in your stream substrate and infect all your fishes and macroinvertebrates and all that kind of stuff. But it's also bad for you because this is unsafe, it's unsightly, and you may have been mowing to the edge of your stream to enjoy this wonderful resource that you have, but it's eventually going to turn into a resource you don't want to look at anymore and you want to deal with. So we don't want you to mow to the edge, and we don't want you to spray. We want you to allow vegetation to grow. So the easiest thing you can do is just to stop mowing to the edge of your stream. And a lot of people ask, hey Gray, you recommend a buffer, but how wide of a riparian buffer do I want to establish? And it's the common answer in science, it depends. It depends on a lot of different things and how big your stream is, what the contributing drainage area is. But the easiest answer is the more the better. If you're trying to just get some banks stabilized and you have a relatively small stream, 15 feet might be the minimum to do it, but adding more and more of a width of unmowed and unmanaged vegetation along that edge is going to provide additional resources for that stream as well, like shading. A lot of those macroinvertebrates need very different habitats with different sunlight requirements and shade. It's going to regulate stream temperatures a lot more. So just providing a wider riparian vegetated area is going to really help fix that situation a little bit. It's not going to connect that stream to its floodplain. It may not in the interim fix that stream bank erosion, but you will allow that vegetation to start to undergo secession. So you may have some different types of trees popping up over time, and you may have a lot of grasses and invasive plants too as well, but that's the easiest kind of way, a hands-off approach. The more hands-on approach is a managed version of doing this, where you allow everything to grow up, you don't plant anything, but you still come in and you remove invasive vegetation so it doesn't overtake the bank and allows more native trees to come up naturally.
Do you mind explaining one more time what you mean when you say connecting to the floodplain?
Yeah. So you have what you call your ordinary high water mark and your bank full. And typically a healthy stream has a normal flow that is not too far away from that bank full. That way, when that stream does start to rise, it is immediately spilling into that floodplain. If your bank full is up here and your ordinary high water mark is way down here, when that stream starts to rise, it is not able to spill over into that bank, so it is not connected to its floodplain. Instead, it is being kept in that channel, which when you're not slowing down that water and you're not allowing it to spill in the floodplain, you're allowing it to maintain how much force it has behind it, and it's going to continue to scour those edges. So you can also do a more managed approach of planting native plants along the edge. You can do that with bare root seedlings from the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. You can do that with 3-gallon plants, 5-gallon plants, and get some native species along there. You can do this with a seed mix too. We have some resources we're going to share with y'all where to source some native plantings and different riparian seed mixes that you can kind of a very low effort plant and get established and allow to grow up along your edge. And these are a lot of species. These are not the only species. We have a few recommended, but if it's native and it's able to do well in a kind of hydric environment, something with wet soils along the edge stream, it'll grow. And often what I tell people is look at the native stuff that's already growing there nearby. That's going to give you a good clue of what's going to do well there at your stream. A lot of these native seed mixes will have some really pretty stuff in them as well. So black-eye Susan, brown-eye Susans, bee balm's one of my favorite that you can plant too. River oats. There's a whole host of different wildflowers and stuff that you can plant that does add an added benefit aesthetically to your garden if you don't want the unkempt kind of appearance that everybody's a little bit afraid of sometimes. Live staking is another one too that is something a homeowner can do and is pretty easy to do once you kind of read through some of the materials on it. And we'll share a resource from the Tennessee Extension Office with y'all as well. But live staking is basically taking a cutting from a woody native vegetation that is able to, you cut off a branch that's about 2 feet long, and you basically sink it into the bank at a 90-degree angle, and that is going to eventually start to sprout out little roots that are going to anchor those banks in place. You typically take that cutting, you stick it in the bank about 2/3 deep into the bank, and then leave that last third exposed, and it will start to put in roots during that first year, and then in subsequent years it's going to start growing into a healthy, mature plant. The survival rates around these can vary. They're typically about 70%. It's pretty cheap. You can do it $1 to $2 per linear foot. Same with just planting bare root seedlings along the side of an edge of a stream too as well. Fairly cheap and approachable. It's fast. You just get some rebar and a hammer and you can pre-do the holes, put that live stake in and make sure it's facing the correct way. And then you stick in a kind of triangular pattern as you're going along the bank, 1 every 3 feet. And if you do that in a triangular pattern, you get about 1 live stake every foot. Cons with this, of course, that's not connecting it to that floodplain as we discussed earlier, so we're still going to have those high erosive flows. And if that stream is too large or it's too flashy, there may be some propensity for that to fail. And then additionally, it only works in certain streams. So what's called a perennial stream is a year that flows all year round. Perennial streams tend to have enough base flow to keep those live stakes watered throughout the year. An intermittent stream that dries out during the year may not have enough sustained flow to allow those live stakes to propagate and leaf out. Additionally, with large bank stabilization projects that are too high, above 3 feet, if you try to live stake too high above the water line, those live stakes also will not survive as well. There's a bunch of different places you can get live stakes. Make sure you're going native. The more local you can source live stakes from, the better. They're going to do better, the more adapted to this ecoregion. These are a couple of folks that we've gotten live stakes from in the past. And the species are usually, silky dogwood, silky willow, 9-bark. Black willow will do well. It's a bit bigger of a tree once it grows out, but that's also one that you can plant as well in addition to all of these species. Permitting. This always comes up. Everybody's kind of curious about permitting, and we're going to give you the kind of easy flash version of permitting real quick with a caveat as it's always best to contact your local municipality and also the state as well before you do this. If you are just revegetating an area, whether you're planting it with bare root seedlings to get that riparian buffer established or live staking, generally you do not need a permit if that is all you're doing. If you're establishing a no-mow zone, everybody, that's a good thing. Please do that. It doesn't require any permitting. Native seed mixes are fine. Removing invasive plants typically does not require any permitting, especially just stay away from herbicide. Usually manual removal methods are the preferred method in these cases. And when I say reach out to your local municipality, sometimes the state has its overarching ARAP 401 certification, and then the Corps of Engineers has a 404. If you're just revegetating, you really don't have to mess with that too much. But always reach out to your state. There's the water.permits@tennessee.gov is the general outreach you can email, and they're usually pretty fast to get back to you on whether you can do that. A local municipality too, please reach out to your local stormwater coordinator. For Hendersonville, it's Helen Morrison. So just reach out if you have any questions. It's way easier and cheaper to get permission than it is to clean up a mess afterwards. So please always reach out first before you do anything. So let's say you have a place where you want to regrade the banks to connect that stream to its floodplain. That's typically something we would recommend you to a certified contractor to do who knows what the permitting requirements are for this kind of stuff, but it's not an engineer level type of fix. A contractor like a certified landscape professional that we have a list of, they're typically around $50 per linear foot, so a little bit more. But what they can do is they can grade back those banks that have eroded for a 3-to-1 slope, put down a biodegradable coir matting, native seed mix, live stakes, some straw, and that is going to help establish that area and reconnect that stream to its floodplain, and they can usually handle a lot of that permitting for you as a homeowner. It is a little bit more expensive, but the job is usually very well done. And these are just some folks that we've worked with in the past. We've had them certified at our workshops for doing this kind of work as well. And again, this is for erosion that is minor and below 3 feet. So National Foodscapes, Gardens of Babylon, Tennessee Naturals, these are all folks that know how to approach this and the permitting requirements for all of this kind of stuff. So what should a homeowner not do? And we see these kind of homeowner fixes all the time, and we understand folks are frustrated and they're trying to fix their stream, and they don't want their houses to be impacted. But I can tell you from experience of a lot of stream walks, all of these things are a big no-no, and they require a lot of permitting if they get approved. And if they do get approved, they also have a high propensity to fail too. So Typically, when you hard armor a stream, whether it's a gabion basket or a riprap or any other type of hard armor structure, you have a few different issues. You're not going to allow vegetation to come up, which is going to impair the stream for other reasons. You're not going to get roots in the ground that are going to increase that storage capacity within the groundwater table next to the stream. But what you're also doing is you're creating a hard surface that when that water comes through, it's going to hit and bounce right off, and it's not going to abate the flow and the force of that stream at all. In fact, it's going to deflect it, and it's either going to impact your neighbor across from you, or it's going to impact the folks downstream. It's also very expensive. So what I typically see what happen with riprap, if it's a professionally done riprap, it'll fix the erosion right up until it ends, and then it's just going to be really bad because all of that water is getting passed down with all that force, and it is just going to scour out everything. It can also hit back and change the direction of the stream, and it'll start cutting into your neighbor's property. And if you want an unhappy neighbor, that's the best way to do it. Self-riprap of putting materials in the stream is a very good way to destabilize it further, and that can cause it to start to peel back behind any kind of material that you put in the stream as well, and further threaten your property too, especially depending on the type of material you use. Gabion baskets, I hate these. They're not the greatest way of stabilizing a stream. What typically happens with these is they're not secured enough at the toe, and they will collapse in the stream, or the stream will work its way behind them. And as soon as the stream is able to start working behind a gabion basket, it is going to just eat and eat behind those gabion baskets and just very, very severely exacerbate that erosion and make it even worse. Concrete block mats, I've seen these as a part of a lot of projects as well. You know, at least here they have regraded this area a little bit too as well, but they don't allow vegetation to grow up. They're not good for wildlife, and I hate looking at them. They're not really pretty. So this is also not, the permitting for this is also pretty intensive as well. And then we see folks use this plastic erosion blankets. This is not allowed in permitting at all, so if you put it down and you have an angry neighbor, you may be required to remove it all anyway. It never biodegrades. We found some decades after a site that had been put in previously before it was disallowed, and it's just a mess to deal with. It traps wildlife, and it's just highly would not recommend it, and it's also not allowed. And I have a lot of folks that are concerned. They say, great, I want to revegetate my stream, but I don't want it to look, you know, messy and gross. And I think the caveat here is when you're revegetating a stream, you got to think about the long term. It usually takes a few years to get that vegetation established, get some nice native tree canopy growing too as well. And it takes a little bit of time for that to return to a nice state. They don't have to be ugly. When you put a lot of those native plants in, a lot of them are really pretty. If you put in New England asters, bee balm, which I've mentioned before, river oats, these I have a lot of aesthetic value in my own property for my other projects that I've used. And I love coming out and looking at them and all the bees that come by. And I think it's a really wonderful resource to have. What you can also too, because a lot of folks want to be able to go to their stream and play in it. And they don't want to wade through a bunch of brush. And, you know, there's kind of a best of both worlds approach you can do here where you can still establish that riparian buffer and just maintain a small path to that stream, maybe a walking trail with some stepping stones or something like that. So you can still come and enjoy a really nice non-eroding creek, but you're still maintaining that riparian area as well. And then throughout the years, as those trees and other herbaceous woody stuff and woody plants start to come up, it's going to return to just a much more prettier state over time. And yeah, that was a lot to cover in a short amount of time, but we have some time for questions now, if we have anybody from the chat or anybody here as well.
Yeah, I'll grab any that come in through the chat, but one that we could touch on a little bit is what types of plants work for different areas, like shade, shallow soils, and maybe the rain garden manual. We'll just run through it.
Okay. So do you mind if I run through that too first? Okay, so the question was what kind of plants work typically for these areas, And the first thing I'll say is we have it's called a rain garden manual for Middle Tennessee, but I can say that a lot of those plants in that manual are adapted to both dry and wet conditions. They're all native, and it'll break it down as a part sun and part shade, and we'll share that resource with you as well. But typically, I've seen black-eyed Susan, bee balm, river oats, and more sunny habitats. Pretty much any kind of canopy trees you can plant there. So like sycamores are going to do well. A lot of different oaks, swamp white oak. These are things that can do well in these areas too. Winged elm. As I mentioned before, see what's already growing out there that's native. You know, you can use iNaturalist. You can even, I learned recently, you can take an iPhone and take a picture of something and click on the information button, and it'll identify the plant for you too as well, which I thought was wicked cool. So that's something else you can also do to figure out if a plant is native or not. And if it is, that plant's doing well, plant more of that. It's going to love it there.
If you have grass growing right up next to the stream, do you have to eradicate the grass first to put in the live stakes, or what do you do with it?
All right, so the question was, if you have grass all the way up to the edge of a stream, do you have to eradicate it first, or what do you do with that grass? And it depends. So if you were going to do a full permitted restoration of a site with a landscape contractor, it would be recommended to remove that invasive grass to get some seed contact with that riparian seed mix you put down, and then also introduce erosion control, because when you get a permit, there is stuff in there that requires, if you do any regrading next to a stream, and I'm sure there's some stuff with the city too as well with any kind of riparian disturbance, you would need to put in erosion control matting in addition to any other things that are required by the permit. You do not have to do that if you're doing less intensive forms of bank repair like live staking. Typically, you are live staking right into that scoured bank, and if it's close enough to the water and saturated enough, you can stake into the grass and allow it to grow. If you want to go more intensive with it, it's good to manage that invasive grass so the stuff can come up, but you don't have to. Did I answer the question fully enough? I think we did have, some questions that were asked previously before the workshop. Maybe we can address a couple of those too as well.
Several of them. There's a permitting question, but you covered that a little bit. The spring.
Limestone specifically, spiderwood. The person who specifically wanted to plant into limestone.
Oh yes, that one. We did have a person who lived in which is pretty typical in Tennessee, a shallow soiled limestone, but almost sounded like a cedar glade from what it was described, and how to restore streams and that kind of area. And that's a tough question. I also live in a place that has about an inch of topsoil and exposed limestone. I have a very hard time getting plants to establish because there's nothing to plant it into. I would say if it's bare limestone at the stream's edge, there's not going to be much you can do to get roots in the ground there. And that stream, since it can't incise, it's going to work its way out. You can plant a little further away from the edge to try to get some stuff established, and it'd be easiest to use a seed mix to do that. And if you're worried about seed washing away, that's okay. It's providing a little bit of benefit to all the areas downstream. But if you seed far enough away from the edge of that bank, you can at least get some plants established before it gets too severe. They also sell plugs that you can plant to as well, and that would probably that would work in maybe 2 inches of soil, kind of depending on what you're planting. So that might be another option if you're having a hard time getting some trees in the ground or something like that. But as mentioned before, if it's being managed in a typical mow to the edge state, just stopping doing that will allow some stuff to establish on its own. And that's what I've done in my yard. And the amount of winged elm and cedars that have popped up on this really shallow soil is amazing. I can't believe all this stuff has popped up.
eroding the bank. Every time I fix one place, spring water cuts in. What do you do?
So the question, I think this is a pre-asked question, was I have a spring in my yard that has popped up and it is eroding no matter how much I try to address it. And I haven't seen the pictures. I don't know how it's currently being managed. But honestly, in that case, especially if it's a stream that has newly formed and is starting to kind of define its own channel, if it doesn't already have vegetation, native vegetation in place, get it in there as soon as it can. I mean, it's going to go crazy. It's going to love it. Definitely get some bare root seedlings there by it if you can. And that, over time, within a 5, maybe 10-year time scale, is going to get those roots in the ground really well and helps solidify that soil and prevent it from eroding away. Do not rip-wrap it, please don't.
All right, we have a question. Is there a recommendation to plant what is needed to help with erosion but does not create snake havens?
Snakes, yes, that is a question I get a lot. And it's a tough one because that is a habitat for all kinds of critters and stuff, the snakes and a lot of native wildlife. The answer is hard because no, that habitat is going to have all kinds of wildlife. Riparian zones are what we call wildlife corridors, and we actually have a trail cam in one, and we've seen river otters, beavers, coyotes, deer, and this is in the middle of Nashville. It's amazing what comes through these. What I typically recommend to people is, if you mow to the edge, those snakes are still going to need habitat. And they're going to look towards your house, under boards, in your outhouse out back, where you're storing your lawnmower. So they're going to be there no matter what. It's better to be informed, and it's better to create a location where you're familiar with how to get in the stream. Like I mentioned before, establishing the riparian area, making sure you have a defined path to the stream where you can still enjoy it. We only have 3 venomous species of snakes in Tennessee, and it's the timber rattler, copperhead, and cottonmouth. You don't really see timber rattlers in middle too much. I've never seen one. I've only ever really seen copperheads ever, but every snake I've ever seen is just a king snake that's eating rats and other kind of wildlife there too as well. So just be informed. Don't go during the breeding season and start flipping over logs and rocks and stuff like that. I have never had an issue with snakes with all the stream walks and meandering throughout the riparian zones in my time doing this, and especially growing up as a kid as well. But that's mainly because I've known what to look for and I've known what to avoid. And so that's pretty much the safest answer I can give you.
If you have things like privet and other invasive species that are big, how do you handle that? Do you cut them back? They may be holding the stream, so what is the advice and guidance on that?
Okay, so the question was in basically invasive management. How do you manage invasives and control them along a stream without disturbing the soil and exacerbating erosion? The first thing we always recommend is don't do a foliar spray because that's just non-selective. It's going to kill everything you do. So if you're messing around with herbicide, it's an easy way to just kill everything you've got. Typically, what we do is we cut things back to allow stuff to grow and outcompete privet and honeysuckle. That is going to be the safe answer of what to do if you don't want to mess with any more intensive kind of controls. If you are more experienced, and this is something that may cause you to have to reach out to your city, is if you cut and paint with herbicide, which is a controlled way of managing privet and honeysuckle, that can keep those roots in place without disturbing the soil, but still kill those roots so they don't start shooting stuff up. Because I have a honeysuckle bush in my yard, and it'll grow 3 to 4 feet every year unless you keep cutting it back. But honestly, the best way is if you have large diameter privet, honeysuckle, Maybe if you have a ground cover like winter creeper, if you're trying to stay away from the herbicide route and you aren't certified or feel comfortable doing that, and you don't want to reach out, fool with the city and deal with permitting or anything like that, the best way is manual removal. And it is a bit intensive, but usually if you can keep the canopy cover down, you can start getting some native canopy cover, which is going to help outshade and outcompete some of that other invasive vegetation as well. It's not foolproof. You'll be doing it for the rest of your life, but usually if you're just doing a manual approach and you're just cutting and you're not doing any pulling of roots, you just have to come back and do that. And I would say before things start seeding out, so before September, I think, is when privet and honeysuckle start producing their berries. That's when you want to cut stuff down, because as soon as they put out those berries, thousands and thousands and thousands, and they have 25% germination rate, and they just get everywhere, and then they're carried down in the stream too as well. So if you can cut that and stuff back, and the best time is in March, because it leaves out, early March, because it leaves out before all the native stuff, which is why it's so good at outcompeting it. And you'll know exactly what is the invasive stuff, because you only have 2 or 3 types of species represented that are leafing out that you can cut back. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we can wrap up for tonight, and appreciate everybody tuning in, listening to this. Of course, you can always reach out to us via email or phone. Again, our website is www.cumberlandrivercompact.org, or you can reach me at email, which is gray.perry, Perry, @cumberlandrivercompact.org as well. And we're happy to answer any questions you may have, or at least point you in the right direction too as well. So. Awesome.